Welcome to your next home. This is the perfect room if you're looking to expand the family. It's perfect. There's a kid's room or a playroom.
Did you say playroom?
Yeah, playroom.
I've been very bad.
You know what, let me give you a moment. I'm gonna feed the pack.
Yeah, you go feed
Okay.
the...
Tips for dealing with the bank. So perhaps you're renting in a property where it is run by a body corporate.
Understanding the basic calculation, income minus expenses, and you want to be left with a positive income.
It is a very tough game. It's not easy at all.
To stay ahead of knowing exactly what your clients need, what their teething issues are.
Have a joint move-in inspection.
That a lot of people that are coming into sectional title homeowners associations are just like you described, not only first-time homeowners, but first-time owners and residents in community schemes.
They get to see the perspective from the other side of the aisle. And I think that's a really important thing to do.
It's a market that's estimated to be transacting at least 9 billion rand per year. So it's a huge market.
In order to get there, you need to be able to build up a track record.
Your cash flow model needs to be sharp.
A quote comes to mind. The best time to buy a property was about 10 years ago. The next best time is now.
Good evening and welcome to the Thursday edition of the Private Property Podcast. It's episode 63. And of course, I'm your host, Zama. I always have to check what day of the week it is. I mean, it's one of those things that I'm sure a lot of us have to always double check because we don't have the greatest sense of what the day of the week is. Well, it is 7 o'clock. And of course, we bring you the latest edition of the Private Property Podcast, where we're talking property, growing our property skill set, making sure that we make the right decisions when it comes to whether starting or growing our property portfolio. And this evening, we're looking at challenging myths preventing you from taking your next real estate investment step. You're probably wondering what that investment step is, what exactly is preventing you from either making that first move or perhaps growing your property portfolio. Then you certainly don't want to miss this evening's competition. But before we start with that, of course, we are running our competition where you stand a chance to win one of two 1,000 Rand cash prizes. And all you have to do to win that competition is to tell us what you love about your city or your town or wherever you essentially live. We want to hear all about it. You can even, share a particular feature that you like about your city or town, and you can enter that competition in the link that we've shared right here below. And we want to hear all about it. We certainly love hearing your stories and want to read more about where you're living and what you love about it so much. The winner of that competition is going to be announced right here on the Private Property Podcast next week, Friday. So you certainly do not want to miss that one. Well, to get started with this evening's competition, I'm joined this evening by Ewan, who is the Managing Director of Think Startup. And of course, we're looking at challenging myths preventing you from taking your next real estate investment step. Ewan, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Good evening, Zama. Thank you very much. It's an absolute honor to be on the show tonight, and I'm really excited to spend some time with you.
So you know what, Eva, I mean, one of the things that I think a lot of us take for granted, especially when we think about decision making or what motivates us to do certain things, is just how important understanding what the fundamental whether tools or skills you essentially need before you start on a, whether it's a property business journey or any other kind of, business journey. Certainly for this podcast, we're looking at property in particular. Perhaps if you can, sort of take us through the process a person needs to go through before they even start a property business, because I think a lot of us always tend to just start accidentally. And I've certainly, shared on the Private Property Podcast, and a lot of viewers have also shared how it was one of those things, you already had your first property and now you're thinking, I want to go into, real estate investing, and you get your first rental property, but you never really perhaps sat down and even found out what's a motivating factor or some of the tools that you essentially need before you start a business. What can you say is the process that we need to go through before we even start, certainly for those at home who are considering going down that journey?
Awesome. I love the question. What I really believe, there's a great quote that says, don't conquer the world, conquer yourself. Now, it sounds almost, I want to say cliche, but there's so much truth within that, because especially if you go into an industry that you maybe don't know anything of, let's say with property as an example, no one is born knowing how to invest in property. And the same with any other skill, because it's a skill, it's something that you can learn. It's not something that's left only for the elite or the ultra wealthy. Most of the people who became ultra wealthy had a big component within property. So a good skill to go and learn is how to actually do this in property. Now, a great place to start, and the reason why I'm using that quote is we have to fundamentally understand ourselves first to know why we maybe will have certain challenges in the days or the weeks or the months ahead when we go into this, can I say, adventure. Because what's going to happen is you, as someone maybe who has no experience in property, is going to hit a wall somewhere. Somewhere it's going to feel like, yes, this thing isn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. Because the problem is we normally start, well, a lot of entrepreneurs, especially with things that you see on social media, I mean, you see entrepreneurs and they've got a specific lifestyle that they're living in. Everybody wants that lifestyle. Everybody wants the suits or the cars or the watches or whatever. And those are the fruits. I mean, there's a great scripture that says, the tree will be known by its fruit. Now, when people look at the fruit, they want the fruit, but they forget that there's a tree that was growing over years of time. There was a seed that was planted to actually create roots. So the question is, our roots will have to be something based on knowledge. So we're going to have to learn something new. Now, I'm going to touch on it a bit later. I thought maybe we can touch it on one of the skill questions, but the thing what we must fundamentally understand is you as the individual are going to have to learn something new from tomorrow onwards. Now, the best place to learn it is from someone or a group or a company that already has done it before. So the best thing is to find mentors, because the mentorships in your life, whether it's a book that you read, maybe you learn something from a book, that specific thing can change your cycle of growth, that learning cycle that you have to go through to actually become a professional investor will shorten it, because we all know the 10,000 hour rule, right? But most people think like 10,000 hours is a lot of time, right? And people don't necessarily have the commitment to put in those hours. Now, a cool way to shorten that learning curve is to make sure that you have mentors in your life or people that you learn from. I mean, there's a bunch of seminars that you can attend where you can actually learn new skills. Now, the cool thing is we need to acquire this new knowledge, and then we need to go and apply this knowledge. You have to go and buy your first property somewhere. Now, there's a lot of excuses, and we're going to come to them shortly, why people say they don't invest, right? There's a lot of statements that people like to make. But the fundamental thing to start the process is to start learning about property. It took me 8 years of actually reading books, going to look at properties before I was in the position to buy a property. And then when I actually had the opportunity, I did it. And that property actually helped me to start my first retail business. I could refinance the property. So just a side note, I could use the property as commercial financing for my business 2 years later. So, but that's a whole different subject. So the main thing is understand that you as a human being isn't born with this, but you are a human being for survival and comfort. So you're going to really have to push through this thing and learn a new skill, and that is how to do it. But the best place is learn from people who's already done it.
And Ewan, when we talk about that, we often realize, as you're saying, that a lot of people will certainly want to be on the receiving end of, an end product, whether it's certainly, to use your analogy, you want the fruits, not understanding that there's a tree that was planted, a tree that was nurtured, and that was tended to, whether it is, over one season or a number of seasons before we get that fruit and you're able to do whatever it is that you do with that fruit. What have you found is then what essentially holds people back? Because I can certainly imagine with a lot of people who have an interest in property, you qualify, so you've got, you're certainly working, you've got a stable income, perhaps you've started viewing, you've started running your numbers, you're certainly watching the Private Property podcast, you're reading different articles on privateproperty.co.za and learning as much as you can. And yet there's still a bit of, as you're saying, resistance in taking that first step, whether it's in buying that first property or perhaps now buying that first rental property. I've certainly been shared with viewers at home that I started looking or certainly viewing in my early 20s, but only officially bought a few years later. And when I was viewing, I certainly could qualify. I was reading as much as I could. Unfortunately, there weren't, shows like the Private Property Podcast or other local resources at the time. But I was quite an eager person who was interested in property. So then what is exactly holding us back? Because I think there's probably people at home who can identify that there's something holding them back and they don't quite know what it is, because we need to overcome that so you can take that first step.
Absolutely. And the thing is, one of the biggest drivers for inaction in our lives is fear. We as human beings really focus on survival first. What is it going to help? What's going to help me to survive? Not necessarily thrive. So normally when we hit a level of comfort, we stay there, we become complacent. So you may be earning a nice salary, you're renting a property in a nice neighborhood, and you can buy, but you've been promising yourself for the last few years you're going to buy, but you never really pull the trigger and actually do it because everything is going quite all right. So it's not like you feel you need to do it. But the biggest thing is, fear is an emotion. You can change the way you look at fear, but the biggest thing where that root lies is limiting beliefs. What is it that you as an individual actually believe, not just about yourself, but what do you believe about the economy? What do you believe about our country's future? And have you done enough research to verify the opinions of the uncle at the bride? I always joke at the seminars that we do, Yaku from Prosperity Enterprises seminar, and we normally joke about the uncle at the bride. And the reason why I'm saying that is we all have a family member who knows everything about everything, right? This person, Bitcoin is launched last week, Tuesday, and they can tell you about the benefits of it this week. And probably this week they're selling you crowd one as well. So just a side joke, but
yeah,
there's always people in your life that's going to speak into your life where you maybe going to get some of your beliefs from. Maybe you grew up in a certain area in our country where you felt that you were either disadvantaged or you were advantaged. So the thing is, we've got so much things impacting our lives, the conditions that we find ourselves in, the environment we find ourselves in, the friends, the family members that we've got. And all these voices, the media speaks into our lives. So the question is, what is it that you're going to believe about those things? So I'm going to take a quick example. The biggest thing for inaction in property, as an example, is not risk. A lot of people believe let's say it's a 1.5 million rand mortgage that I need to take out for this investment. That's a lot of money. The risk is too high. Now, for the viewers, I know most of you know that property is definitely the lowest risk investment that you can make, guaranteed. Yes, maybe the amount is a bit high in some areas that you're going to buy, but I really believe the biggest thing why people do not commit to buy that first place is not a factor of risk. They say it's risk, but it's not risk. The underlying issue is it's a long-term commitment. I know in 2020 and the last 15 years, we live in a world where instant gratification is the main thing. I mean, I have friends that didn't invest in property the last 5 years, every year saying the same thing, that it's too high risk. But when they had the opportunity to invest in Bitcoin, they did. They threw a lot of money there, and 6 weeks later, they lost 50% of their money. So question, was it a risk thing or not? It wasn't. It's not about risk. It's about commitment. It's a bit more the idea of it's a longer term commitment, and it's really not. I mean, you can sell a property after you've bought it. So once you've bought that first place, I mean, all the viewers listening tonight, you who already have bought a place know that after buying that first place, it's like a bug that almost bit you. It's like you feel like, I want to get my second place and I want to get my third place, because now the knowledge that you had, you applied, and with the application of that knowledge, it produces experience. But the experience produces wisdom. And that's where the fundamental lies. Once you go through the practical part, because you can also read all the books that you want, but if you never buy that first place, you will never actually fundamentally produce that wisdom to know that, listen, this is not as hard as they said it was. I shouldn't have never listened to my uncle at the braai or my friend who never bought a property, right? Because there's a lot of people who know all the practical stuff to do, but they've never done it. So never focus on what is not possible. A great example, just quickly, is how do you break a limiting belief? A limiting belief you can break by changing the way you ask your questions. What do I mean about that? I'm going to take an example. Let's say in one of our retail businesses, I asked the following question. Why are my sales slow this month? Right? It sounds like an innocent question, Zama. Why are my sales slow this month? The problem with that question is it's got a presupposition, a negative presupposition in it to say that the direction of the question is leading me not to an answer or a solution for the problem. It's just going to give me symptoms of the problem. So if I say, why are my sales slow this month? I'm going to come up with excuses like, well, it's the economy, it's the politics, it's COVID. But if I change that question with a positive presupposition, so I can ask myself, what 3 practical steps can I take to increase my sales this month? Because now it presupposes that there's still enough time left for this month because the first one didn't. And secondly, that it's still possible. And now the answers I'll get to that question are, well, even you can send out 3 more emails to 10 extra customers and see, maybe some of them buys. The same with property. Instead of asking, why can't I find a property that produces positive cash flow? You ask the question, where can I find a property that produces positive cash flow? So that now puts your focus into the direction of finding a solution. I hope that answers your question, Zama.
Yeah, no, it certainly does, Ewan. And we're going to go for a quick break. And after the break, one of the things I actually want us to explore is certainly what kind of skills we need to be cultivating as property entrepreneur, as because we're essentially looking at some of those myths that are preventing us from growing our property, businesses. So exploring what are some of the myths, but also what skill sets do we need in order for us to either start our property businesses or grow our property businesses. And lastly, what we should be doing when things are going well. I think one of the things about this COVID-19 crisis is it certainly caught a lot of property investors off guard. Some of them perhaps weren't adequately equipped to handle a crisis of this nature, where their own tenants may not be able to either pay rent or pay on time. Perhaps they didn't have an emergency fund. So what kind of systems should we be putting in place when we're running a property business to ensure that the next crisis, hopefully not at the extent of COVID. I think we've had a big enough crisis in this lifetime, but certainly how to be best equipped to handle crisis as property entrepreneurs? Because that's a skill set that we tend to not focus on too much. And of course, to viewers at home, I certainly want to hear from you. Have you found yourself being stopped, or you stopping yourself from taking that leap of faith or that next step on your property journey? What did you do to overcome that? Were there certain, tools that you used? Perhaps there was a particular course that you took that made things click. We certainly want to hear how you overcame that. And what skill have you found to be valuable on your property journey? Because I think a lot of us are trying to figure out what's the best skill match, or the right skills we should be having in our bucket that will help us, good property investors, and for us to be able to grow our property businesses. So if there's a skill that you've certainly picked up as a valuable skill that you think anybody who's considering to go into property should have, then please do share it down here below with us. We certainly want to hear from you. We're going to be back after this quick break, and of course I'm joined by Ewan Rourke, who is the director, the managing director at Think Startup. We'll be back just after this.
Welcome to your next home. This is the perfect room if you're looking to expand the family. It's perfect. There's a kids' room or a playroom.
Did you say playroom?
Yeah, playroom.
I've been very bad.
You know what, let me give you a moment. I'm gonna feed the pan.
Yeah, you go feed the whatever.
Welcome back to episode 63 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama. This evening, we're looking at challenging myths that are preventing you from taking your next real estate investment step. And to help us better understand what it is that's holding us back and some of the tools we'll need to overcome that, and certainly the skill set that we need to be working on getting on our real estate investment journey. This evening, I'm joined by Ewan Rourke, who is the managing director at Think Startup. Ewan, before we went to the break, I certainly wanted us to look at the skills that we need to be cultivating as property entrepreneurs, property investors that are going to help us either start on our property journey or certainly grow our property businesses. What are some of those key critical skills? Because I think we certainly spend a lot of time right here at the Private Property Podcast looking at some of the things you ought to be doing, which is very valuable because those are things that are important to make sure that you're able to either, get the right property, get the right price, negotiate well, and understand the nitty-gritty of the property journey, how to manage, the tenants. But when we haven't quite explored the skill set that's also needed to be able to do those various things and to be able to do them as best as possible, which is something that's quite important, especially for those at home who haven't yet taken that journey, or for those who started very accidentally, like many of us start, and now they're looking to sharpen their own skill set so that they can show up as their best selves in their property businesses. So what are those skills that we ought to be working on, making sure that we sharpen as much as possible so that we can have very successful property businesses?
Okay, great. I would say, Zama, the number one skill definitely, hands down, and especially if you're serious about investing in property and you really want to build something scalable and that can actually grow, the number one thing is you have to learn the numbers. And you have to understand when it comes to numbers, emotion has to exit the room. Now, we are human beings, right? We are emotional. So you walk into a property and you see this nice kitchen or this nice view or whatever the case might be, and the emotion takes over and you decide, yes, I want to buy this place. I mean, it's a brilliant investment, but the numbers don't make sense. And then you decide to buy on emotion. Now, the thing is, we don't like to admit it, but we are irrational, right? We make our buying decisions normally based on emotion, whether it's cars, whether it's furniture, whether it's houses, whatever the case might be. So if you buy a place for yourself to stay, yes, use emotion, right? Because you want to have a nice place, but you have to be able to afford it as well. Don't compete with the Joneses. However, when it comes to investing and building a property business that you can actually scale means we go from 1 or 2 properties to 100 to 400. It's possible. If you only have one now and you don't believe you can own 400, change your mindset. You can own 400. The question is, what are you looking at? So the numbers is critical, because the numbers is going to say whether a property is a good investment or not. Yes, area does make a big difference. However, most of the areas in our country grow. Our property, if you're going to look at statistics the last 50 years, property prices in our country has only been down 3 years in 50 years' time. I mean, if you look at that on a graph, you don't even see those 3 years actually dipping. So that graph keeps on going up. And one of the big reasons for that is our population grows at a phenomenal rate. So the demand, if you understand economics 101, the demand obviously is there, and it will still be there for the next 50 years. I mean, we're not building enough houses quick enough to house the population growth. So that's the basic. So that is a settled thing, that your property will grow. However, you have to know what are the additional costs. So what does levies mean? I mean, what does it mean to have a certain cap rate? If you don't understand these terms, you are going to have to make sure that you acquire the knowledge so that you can actually become a professional investor. And professional investor, I mean, because any person who has 1 or 2 properties is an investor, right? But what does a professional investor mean? Professional investor means I'm getting paid to do it, right? We all can drive a car, but who gets paid driving a car? Only a professional. So are you a professional investor that actually gets paid for the work that you put in there, whether it's part-time or full-time? So the number one skill is know the numbers, so that you can look at a property that's posted on private properties website, scan through it, see this is the levies, this is the area, this is the size, this is the rent. Yes, this is a good deal. Let me go and view it. And then you can find out, is the seller maybe motivated? There's like 8 different reasons why someone can be motivated to sell. If you understand those, you can maybe buy the place for a better price. For a win-win situation, you make your money when you buy. So number one skill, Zama, numbers.
And of course, we are, to viewers at home, taking your questions and comments. Certainly want to find out whether you've encountered that, or you've struggled to take that step. What did you do to overcome it? Perhaps you're currently there and you're still trying to figure out how to take that step in growing or starting your property business. We've got here a comment from Andile Majola from YouTube, who says it's definitely fear on my side too. Martha Fari also on YouTube saying, we've bought 3 properties directly from developers in the last 15 years. Now I have a fear of buying secondhand and negotiating through such a deal, which is something, of course, that can happen, that sometimes you get so used to doing something in a particular way. The moment you want to do it differently, it does become a bit difficult for you. Another one here also from YouTube is from Martina Fari, who asks, what would be the most powerful skill to have in choosing your property investment, negotiating skill, communication skill, running your numbers, or going through statistics? And as Ewan said, it's certainly running your numbers is that big skill, or that key skill that he says is quite important. We've got another one here also from YouTube coming in from Andy Lematola, who says, how does one overcome this fear? Also, what should one rather look out for when considering a joint bond? So how do we overcome that fear, Ewan? Because it's certainly a big component or a big thing that a lot of us go through when it comes to our property journeys. This is going to be the biggest decision oftentimes that we're going to make. We'll always talk about the fear of the unknown, the fear of that big debit order, the fear of having all that debt, because sometimes you just look at it as, oh my God, this is debt. And it can be quite overwhelming. Chances are you've probably never bought something that expensive before, and now you're thinking this is quite a huge commitment. You've probably never been in a relationship that long. You're now entering potentially a 20-year-long relationship. So how do we essentially overcome that fear?
I love that question. The thing is, it's a great place to be at, to be able to admit, to say, listen, I'm afraid to pull this trigger. And the reason why it's a good thing is because, let me ask you this, when do we normally experience fear? We normally experience fear before the event happens. So it's normally a self-produced feeling, it's a self-produced emotion that we have of the unknown. Now, if you can clarify for yourself, what will that unknown entail for me? So let's take an example. Maybe start, when it comes to property, start with the smallest property you can physically buy. So maybe if you stay in a metropolitan, maybe a student accommodation unit close to the university or Technicon that you know there's a really high demand for. Normally, in some of these areas, the prices, the capital gain isn't necessarily as high, but you can buy a smaller place for a great price and maybe end up cash flow positive. I mean, we did that here in Bloemfontein. So if you maybe go for a smaller stretch, so instead of thinking just, I'm going to have a 20 million rand property portfolio, because that's a far reach for a beginner, right? Start with a 400,000 rand unit. The nice thing about property is how you can reel in that fear is go to the bank. Most of the banks have great first-time buyer programs. So you can get 100% loan. I mean, some of the banks like Absa I know as the FLISP, which is a great opportunity that you can use as well. So go and buy your first place. But here's the thing, and this is what will make the fear a lot less, is the cool thing about property is you have to have an exit strategy if you really are but fear-based. So worst case scenario, even if I don't like this whole process, I can just sell the place again. And the bank, whoever loaned you the money, will get their money back, right? So if you buy in a decent place, you're not going to lose the value of the property. But if you have some grit, you can hold on to it for 3 years. Maybe you make 100K or 200K on that property. But once you've done that first property, that fear disappears. Absolutely. I mean, most of the people listening tonight who's already bought a place knows, why did I fear this thing? Because it's not that intense. I mean, your risk is really low.
That initial fear, you certainly got over that initial fear. I think a different kind of fear may arise, certainly as one of our viewers, pointed out, that you're now doing property, you're doing it a certain way, and you now have a fear of doing it a different way. Perhaps you're used to, buying in a new development, like our viewers pointed out, or this time around you want to diversify and you go from buying apartments to buying a house. And that might be a different fear altogether, but you certainly no longer have the fear of making that first step. Ewan, before I let you go, I cannot, let you go before asking this one. So we're now running our property businesses. It's going relatively well. What should we be doing when things are going well? Because I think we tend to underestimate what kind of systems one ought to be putting in place when things are going well. And it's one of those things that are very difficult sometimes, because you realize them retrospectively when things are now no longer going well. And you realize that, had I done X, Y, Z when things were going so well, I could have probably been able to manage this slightly better. So what should we be focusing on, certainly doing, or systems that we should be putting in place when things are going well in our property business?
Well, one of the main things is, whether you're starting out or whether it's going well, if you're only starting out now, keep in mind that one day when it goes well, you want to make sure that you have already put systems in place. Because once you've built a big property portfolio, if there's certain things you want to change, then maybe it's a bit more difficult. So from the beginning, make sure your structuring is right. So the entities that you normally would buy your properties in. So if you want to scale, make sure that you have it in the right entities from the beginning. If you don't get there, you can still change. But then the other thing is, Richard Branson has a cool thing, what he normally says when he looks at a specific business or business venture, he would always say, protect the downside. So what is it that I need to protect if I'm building a big property empire, right? especially if you may be highly geared. Maybe you're really pushing to buy as many properties as you can as quick as possible. So yes, you've learned about OPM, you're using the bank's money, but now you're highly geared. Maybe something shifts in the economy. So on paper, it's going well with you, but maybe cash flow wise, not that well. So you want to make sure that you either have a cash reserve or that you're not too highly geared, that when something goes a bit south, when the economy changes, when interest rates go up, make sure that you have a safety net. And I don't want to say like a nest put away, but make sure that you can survive a short term. And when I say short term in property, it means 6 months to 1 year. So let's take an example. Previous years when the interest rates really skyrocketed to like 18%, if you go and look at the graphs, that 18% doesn't stay there for very long, right? So most people fear that. But what if you only had cash reserves for additional 6 months to make sure that it mitigates that short spike in interest rate? Because normally our economy will establish and bring down that interest rate again. So make sure that you mitigate some of the risk by either not being geared, and that's financed too high, or make sure that you have some cash put away that if something goes a bit south, that you also can be a lenient landlord and say, listen, I know this person just lost their job. I'm going to give them housing for free for 3 months. Because that's the last thing I quickly want to say. When things go well with you, make sure that you share that wealth. And I don't necessarily mean the physical money, but if you've learned something about in property or in business that you didn't know before, share it with someone. Share it with someone outside of your family. Share the knowledge that you acquired and the wisdom that you acquired. And help someone else out of the position where they're at currently to see if they can also reach new heights. Thanks.
Ewan, the last comment from our viewer at home comes from Ndogozo Mbele, who says, procrastination was a factor on my side, fear of a long-term commitment. I'm over that now. And I'm it's certainly one of those things that I think a lot of us, struggle with. We procrastinate so long. We certainly fear that long-term commitment. And I know because I've certainly been there myself. And I'm sure that, many viewers at home, even as we continue this conversation on our social media platforms right here on Facebook and YouTube, we certainly want to hear what have been some of the things that have held you back and what have you done to overcome that. I think this is one of those things that we all sometimes struggle with or have at some point, certainly on our property journey, struggle with. We certainly want to know how you overcame that so that those of us who are still on that boat can learn from each other. Ewan, we're going to leave it there this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Zama. Appreciate it.
And that is Ewan Rourke, who is the managing director at Think Startup. But of course, that brings the end of this evening's episode of the Private Property Podcast. It certainly has been a great one. I think one of those things that we do underestimate is how to take care of our, I'll say, intellectual self when we're on our property journey, and making sure that we're learning as much as we can, that we go back to implementing what we've learned, but also taking care of also our mental state. I think we sometimes downplay how important making sure that we flex our mental muscle and learn the right skill set, put in the right systems to ensure that we're able to show up as our best selves as we run our property businesses. It's certainly something that is very easy to overlook when you're doing property, because you're so busy trying to work on the next deal, putting together that deal and chasing the bank and structuring it as well as possible. I know structuring has come up yet again on this evening's podcast. We did promise that we're going to be having an episode on structuring. I haven't forgotten. We will definitely have a conversation on structuring. I know a lot of investors want to find out what the best way to structure our property portfolios are, whether we should be buying in a PTY, should we be putting it in a trust, what are the tax implications when we do this. This is certainly a conversation that we are going to have just for you. And of course, if you have any other topics you want us to tackle, then please do share below which topics you want us to tackle. Perhaps it's something that you've been struggling to wrap your head around and don't quite know how to best navigate it. We certainly want to hear from you, and we'll bring in an expert guest to help us better understand it. Well, folks, that's it from me, Zamantunga Kumalo. We're back again tomorrow with the latest Private Property Podcast. But until then, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Clifton Smithers. I live in Belito, where my partners and I run a business called Union 3. As a family, we chose to move here about 6 years ago. What attracted us to the area was the safe and relaxed lifestyle of the North Coast. We're surrounded by so much natural beauty, and we love that it's so casual. It's just not as intense as a busy city. In fact, that's one of the main reasons there's so many people moving into the area. There's some amazing lifestyle estates out here. We've got St. Barley, Brettonwood Estate, and Zimbiti, to name a few. The Belito Lifestyle Centre caters to everyone's needs. There's also some smaller commercial centres like Tiffany's in Salt Rock. There's some excellent restaurants to choose from, and there's a really wide variety of activities on offer. From mountain biking out on the trails to surfing at any one of the beaches, there really is something for everyone. This quiet little town really comes alive over the weekend. The live concerts in the farmers market at the Lychee Orchard is very popular. With the new international airport just 15 minutes down the road and the unmatched lifestyle that this place offers, it's no wonder that the North Coast is the fastest growing town in South Africa. My family and I absolutely love it here, and this is our neighborhood.